Okay, the reading this week is going to be from Joshua chapter 9. If you want to head over there, we'll talk about that a little bit in the podcast today. Joshua chapter 9. Hope you're enjoying your reading through the book of Joshua. Again, we're reminded when we get to 9 with the story of the Gibeonites that this really isn't a war story as much as it is.
No, that's incidental to the real point of this story.
You know, I think I've been kind of reading it through those eyes this year, through that lens, maybe the best way to say that. And it's just so interesting that it's really just a collection of stories from the conquest, right?
Yeah, the spiritual conquest that may or may not be happening.
Yeah. And so one of the things that strikes me about the Gibeonites is that these stories in some ways illustrate how faith is sometimes messy because, early on, Israel shows great faith in going up to Jericho and doing exactly what God says. They're successful.
Right.
Except for Achan,
right,
who is not faithful and winds up making a terrible mistake. That hurts them at eye. And we have that mess, which is then righted when they deal with Achan and they do what the Lord says and they go conquer the city.
Right.
And everything's looking good again. You know, this is post-Jericho again. We're looking good.
Right.
And now we have another mess with Gibeon. And this even seems like different than the Achan story. Achan's just obviously rebellious. God said this, I'm not going to do it. This seems a little bit more like, they're not thinking.
Negligence. It's negligence.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not willful rebellion, but it is spiritual negligence that still causes a problem.
So let's talk a little about the story.
Yeah. Though I do think, part of what helps us understand the significance of this story, you got to understand the background of what Moses had told them right before they went in the land. Deuteronomy chapter 7. Where God through Moses literally said to them explicitly, and he names a bunch of these peoples there at the beginning of the chapter, and these peoples would cover the Gibeonites, who are really just a few miles outside of Jerusalem. To put it in perspective, they're not far away.
Though they appear to be.
Well, that's their point, and that's because they may know. In fact, commentators sometimes wonder if they knew enough about the law, because what the law said, Deuteronomy chapter 7, was, when the Lord your God gives these peoples over to you and you defeat them, you must devote them to complete destruction. That's the haram we talked about with Jericho. Not the whole city, but the people. You have to wipe the people out, and you shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. This wasn't negotiable. So they say, I feel compassionate about this. God has said, mercy's not your choice on this. I'm telling you, no covenant, no mercy, wipe them out. They're haram. They're under the ban. Destroy the people. However, God said in chapter 20, for faraway people, you can make Deuteronomy chapter 20, you can make a covenant of peace, basically, because the whole point is, in fact, if you read a little bit more in chapter 7, the point's always been influence. The locals will influence you in a way, and in a way that, in theory, the long distance folks shouldn't. And so, it's one thing to have peace with those far away, so you're not shooting armies back and forth at each other all the time. But the locals, no, I'm with you to help you destroy them, because, again, read the rest of Deuteronomy chapter 7, they're going to corrupt you. You let them live, they're going to corrupt you. And so I'm telling you flat out, no covenant, no mercy. They're under my decree of destruction.
And yet,
chapter 9 happened.
Part of dealing with the world that is important for us to remember is you're dealing with folks who don't operate by the same value system.
Right.
And I'm thinking that Joshua and Israel, the last thing they thought was that somebody would deceive them,
right,
and appear to be from a long way off when they're not.
Yeah.
And I guess the question I always have when I'm reading this story is, so why don't they consult God about that?
Well, in fact, the story itself will raise that point.
Yes.
Yeah.
So they're only deceived, and we can't really know what drove them to do this. Are they feeling a little bit full of themselves, after these 2 victories? Are they, feeling like they're in control of this, or, or was it just negligence on their part? And maybe to some degree we'll never know that, but they're just not thinking, and anticipating how wildly and valueless their opponent is going to be in this.
Well, and it's funny, even the way the story's set up, in chapter 9 there in verse 4, they on their part acted with cunning. The Hebrew there is literally comes from the same root as what Satan did in the garden. And so, that whole, paradise. And that's the thing is we forget that. It's not just a matter of overt rebellion. We have to be, in fact, this reminds me of what Paul said about false teachers in Romans chapter 16, actually, that we have to be aware of not just overt rebellion, obvious wickedness and rebellion. We have to be aware of not being deceived, because Satan was deceptive in the garden. Adam and Eve were not looking for overt rebellion, but they were deceived because they did not just stick with God's will and inquire of God if they needed to. And so the same thing, Romans 16, verse 18, talking about false teachers, those who cause division and whatnot. For such persons do not serve our Lord Christ, but their own appetites, and by smooth talk and flattery, they deceive the hearts of the naive. Sometimes, being innocent can actually make you vulnerable to the wickedness of the world. There is a place for recognizing that the world wants to deceive the naive, the innocent, the pure. And that you kind of get the feeling in this story. It doesn't absolve them of their failure, but that's one of the things that those who are trying to live by God have to realize all the more. Satan is by nature a liar and a deceiver, and those who follow him will by nature lie and deceive. And the good-hearted are just patsies and marks for that. And
Which is exactly what happens.
That's
to
what the story
Israel.
is. Yeah, that's
Yes,
exactly what the story is.
They wind up making covenant with Israel instead of being among those who are annihilated from the land, and now we have a problem.
Yeah, we do. We got a covenant with people who should not have been covenanted with.
Okay, so let's map it out. How does the story end?
Well, once once the big reveal comes, as I started about verse 16 or so, at the end of 3 days after they made a covenant with him, they heard that they were their neighbors. They lived just around the corner, as it were, and that they lived among them. And again, that language matters. They lived among them. That exactly the type of people you weren't supposed to have. And the people of Israel set out and reached their cities on the third day. Now, the cities were, and it lists a bunch of cities there. But the people of Israel did not attack them because the leaders of congregation had sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel. They brought God's name into it. They'd sworn by God's name and
made a covenant.
That's it. And
covenant mattered. That's another lesson.
Covenant matters to God, and that's why taking oaths, swearing in God's name. We call it profanity sometimes, but it matters. They'd invoked the name of God over this commitment they had made, and so all the congregation now murmured against the leaders. You guys are supposed to be checking on this stuff. Always read the fine print. Moral of the story, always read the fine print. Terms and conditions may apply.
What were y'all thinking?
Yeah. But all these the congregation said, we have sworn to them by the Lord, the God of Israel, and now we may not touch them. This we will do. We will let them live, lest wrath be upon us, because the oath we swore, we made a commitment, and we invoked God's name over this. But let them become cutters of wood, drawers of water for all the congregation, just as the leaders had said. And it is interesting, though, in the fallout from this, start about verse 22, when Joshua, it just says to him, why'd you do this? I'm sitting here, you read this, you read this on the surface, you're thinking, because they didn't want to die. They've seen what happens, they didn't want to die. Yeah. So ironically, they're deceiving Israel is, in fact, in one sense, a confession of the fact that Jericho's gone and Ai's gone, and we know what happened in Egypt. I mean, they realize that they have, this is not about armies, numbers, and battle plans. This is about a God that cannot be beaten.
That's exactly right.
And so in one sense,
you can't beat them, join them.
Right. And it's why commentators again sometimes wonder, did they had already learned enough about Israel to know per the law that if they were distant nations, distant peoples, God had given Israel permission to leave them alone. And so that's why they portrayed themselves that way. They didn't portray themselves as locals petitioning for peace. They deceived by portraying themselves as because they knew if they were locals, they were dead. And so, but Joshua innocently, why'd you deceive us and say we were very far from you? But there's an interesting thing in verse 23 that there's a little bit extra added to the nature of the judgment that Joshua pronounces over them. They're not just going to be servants in general. They're going to be servants for the house of my God. They're kind of a little bit maybe of a way to redeem this a little bit. You lied to the people of God, so you will serve their God. If you're going to live by serving our God. We will literally make you basically doing the menial labor that the tabernacle and the temple, in theory and time, would require. Yeah,
they found a way not to get killed. That's what verse 26
right? Verse 24.
At the end of the day, we're going to live.
Yeah. So we feared greatly for our lives because of you and did this thing. We didn't want to die.
So this is interesting. It's an interesting place to make a point about covenant keeping.
Yeah.
And how serious a matter that is to God. Because I think that we live in a time where that whole concept has just been lost.
Well, we don't think about covenant. The concept of covenant in the first place is gone.
Well, but think about, even, let's use a simple example, like buying something on a credit card.
Yeah.
That's a covenant.
You're making a commitment to return the money.
Promising to pay. And how many people are perfectly comfortable not honoring that covenant?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Strategic bankruptcy. Using bankruptcy as a tool to get out of the debts they never intended to pay back.
Exactly. And not feeling the burden of.
Yeah.
I mean, I've known the opposite story. Some disciples who carried heavy financial burdens
because they wanted to keep their word,
because they weren't going to dishonor the covenant, even if there was a quote unquote legal way
to get out of it,
for me to escape responsibilities to it. And so let me pitch you a softball, if I have you so far on that.
Oh yeah,
I think about the marriage covenant.
I was thinking the same thing. You got there before I could. Absolutely.
And how a lot of people are like, well, okay, so I rushed into this and I didn't think about this, and I'm with someone I'm not happy with. I don't want to be bound to that covenant.
Yeah.
And they walk away.
And what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And so we get so worried about the rights to remarriage and when can I remarry, we forget there's a step before that for the God-fearing person you got to ask yourself, which is, by what rights am I divorcing a spouse?
We really need to underline when people are pondering marriage. It's something to talk to your kids about, especially, you've got some teenage kids who are, getting the latter part of high school and getting ready to go off to college and enter into that season when they really are going to begin kind of narrowing down the spouse selection process. The fact that this isn't about a big fancy party.
Yeah.
This is about what happens after the big fancy party, and the fact that you're going to covenant to be with this person the rest of your life. And you don't get a mulligan on it. You don't get to get 5 years down the road and say, I think I want to do over. I don't like this. I really do think there's a profound lack of respect for covenant anymore. And you see it in these kinds of areas, even among God's people.
That's right. And I think at the end of the day, we've listened to the world's lies that marriage is about my personal happiness. And therefore, my personal happiness determines how faithful I have to be to the covenant, or my romantic feelings of love. When in reality, in the Bible, it's about commitment. When I'm getting married, I'm making a commitment to keep the vows that I have made, regardless of whether I am always happy as I do so or not. God looks for commitment. We have made it about us and our personal happiness.
Yeah, I think way too much focus on a whole series of parties which surround weddings now, and not nearly enough focus on the seriousness of covenanting before God. And that is something that I think this story speaks to and gives you an opportunity, maybe spend some time thinking about with your family as you start laying the foundations in their future choice of a spouse. So covenant, and also that, sometimes, in the story, we're just back and forth. They have these good moments. They're like Peter.
Yeah.
They have the good moments and then they have the disasters. And sometimes that's just the nature of our faith too. Yeah. It's not I get the pinnacle and everything is good. It's that I kind of struggle with it all the way through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Something to ponder as well as you spend some time reading in Joshua chapter 9 this week.